In this video, we are continuing with the realistic portrait drawing guide, looking at how I create a range of realistic looking skin textures in pencil. So this is where I'm at with the drawing up to now. I've drawn in the eyes, nose and also the mouth below his moustache there, and so I'm done with most of these features for the time being. However, you can see by looking at my outlines that I've got a lot of areas to cover, and by looking at this reference image you can see the skin texture that I'm going to have to reproduce in pencil. But let's get started, and I can discuss this process as you watch me draw on screen. I'll start by covering this nose. As always, I will put the reference image on screen for you to compare. Now, I've begun by shading in the sides here because you'll notice in the reference image how there's a shadow casting across that side of his face. And this also helps to define the shape of the nose. I apply a little more pressure with the pencil to create these darker shades around it. I am still using the 2B pencil here as well, and I will continue to do so until the later stages. I then progress towards the middle of the nose where there's some lighter areas to deal with. Now, through observing the reference image and looking at the texture of the skin in this area, you'll notice that all of the pores of the skin, I suppose, come together to create a series of marks which travel in different directions, and this is what I make an effort to do here when I draw this. I create a series of marks moving the pencil in circular directions, and these are all close together, and in this section I make sure not to shade in the gaps between them because, again, if you look at his nose in the reference image, you'll see the lighter, or should I say the whiter areas that are there. Again, to emphasize that shadow to the side, I do the same, but I just apply a little more pressure when drawing around that part. As I move over to the section below the glasses here, I start to draw from a new grid line, and I start here because, again, you'll see on the reference image that there's these wrinkles in his skin that I need to add, and I'm always sure to get these important details out of the way first before proceeding into creating a general skin texture around them. Now, I render most of the skin by approaching it the same way as I just did on the nose. However, the small marks that I make with the pencil will vary in shape and direction based on what I see in the image that I am working from. For example, you can see here on screen how these marks that I make are directed downwards on an angle, similar to how they appear in the reference image. As I move sideways towards the nose again, notice how these marks change direction again. Above this, there's a lighter section which I approach the same as the texture I made for the nose. Again, these are circular marks that I make with the pencil, and I do this here to join this up. Continuing to move down, again I prioritise drawing in the wrinkles for the skin first before working around them. I also have to draw in a series of small but darker lines to represent the stubble on his face. Those smaller hairs travel up the side as well, but this is something that I add in afterwards. As I progress up the side of the face here, again the lines that I add with the pencil to form this texture are directed upwards. I always make sure to leave some smaller gaps in between them, as this helps to highlight the pores in the skin. I also add some of those darker lines for the hairs, although I do adjust the pressure that I apply with the pencil to create darker lines where necessary. Don't worry too much about doing it at this moment in time, as I will be coming back to this at a later stage and working into the drawing as a whole. Anyways, you can see now by looking at what I've drawn so far how effective this way of producing a skin texture is. These small marks all come together to form a texture that looks convincing. Here I'll finish drawing in this side of his face. Again, remember to always be observing the reference image you are working from as you draw. Now I'll move over to the other side and repeat what I did here. For the most part, I take the same approach with it all. The only difference is that there's a much darker shadow against this side of his face. I began by drawing in the wrinkle at this side, and then I worked around that. You can see when comparing what I draw with the reference image on screen, how the lines and marks that I make with the pencil are drawn in the same direction. The smaller details, such as the stubble, is then drawn over the top of the texture that I produce. Okay, so where this shadow is, I apply a lot more pressure to create some darker marks in this direction. As always, I leave gaps in between this to represent the hairs which must be reflecting the light. You still see those smaller hairs in this section in the reference image. From this point, I work back towards the rest of what I've drawn. So that's the centre of his face done, and although the results look impressive, it's a very simple method, and again, we'll be taking a very similar approach to draw all of this. Before I move up to his forehead, I'll just fill in this area between the eyes. Okay, so now we are tasked with covering a large area of space. I'm not saying that Walter White here has a large forehead, although I kind of am, but in doing this, we will come across a few wrinkles in his skin there, along with having to draw out the short hairs on his head. Again, let's not overthink it at this stage, and I'll talk about it all when we get to it. I'm going to begin at the side here, at this grid line. Right away, I define my outline with some darker lines for the hairs on his head. If you look at the image we are working from, you'll see that all around his head there's this darker outline formed by those hairs, so you'll often see me add this in as I progress with this. Again, before I add any general texture to this, I make sure to add any of the more unique details, such as the lines in his skin here. Following on from this, I begin adding a texture, which here is going to be different due to the hair we have to draw in. One thing that's worth paying attention to is the direction of the hair. Notice how when I begin drawing this, how I direct the lines I draw in the same direction as the hair as is in the reference image. Between each of these hairs, I leave gaps which I lightly shade over. In addition to these longer hairs, there are these almost stray hairs away from this, which I also add here. So once I'm done with this area, I move over to the side and start to outline these wrinkles in the forehead. I've already outlined where these are when I outlined the drawing using the grid in an earlier video. Between these, I create that same texture as before by making circular motions with the pencil to produce these different marks. I then move up to another section on the outside and draw in the hairs again, being sure to consider the direction these are heading in. You can see how I intentionally leave gaps between these lines that I draw. I also draw them at different lengths. Patience really is key when it comes to this style of drawing. You want to pay attention to the smallest of details. It might sound extreme, but I aim to draw every hair, wrinkle, and even the pores on his skin exactly as I see it. You can see as I progress how I create a more generic texture the same way as before. Now towards the top and around the middle of the forehead here, the texture of the skin changes slightly. Instead of seeing all of the pores and details in the skin that can easily be drawn as we have been doing, this area seems to be smoother. There's also these blotches on his skin, freckles which appear darker on top. And so here, I'm making the effort to draw those out first, and then I plan on lightly shading over it all. I'm continuing to work around his head here, being sure to have my lines heading in the right direction. It's quite satisfying seeing all of this come together, it just takes time. When I get to the top of his head, there's a lot more of these hairs that I need to draw in. Again, I draw these in as they are, being lines at different sizes. Pure pencil sharp as you do this, and where these hairs start to fade away, they become stubble. So I add a series of dots around this area on top of the texture that I had made for the skin. So now I've drawn out a good amount of his forehead, and I'm back working into the wrinkles below here. Now to finish his forehead, I'll be taking the same approach as I've just demonstrated, so I won't narrate all of this, but that's one thing that's probably worth noting, right, is that this way of drawing often has you repeating the same techniques and methods to draw most things. I've found that it's more about the textures you create and the details you add, which result in a realistic looking drawing. Anyways, here I'll continue to finish this section. You can see here how I apply much less pressure with the pencil as I cover the middle of his forehead due to a lot more light casting on this area. You can see on the reference image how there are these white gaps between the pores of his skin. Further up, these fade away, and I'm tasked with drawing a more smooth and consistent texture. The lines that I draw in for his hair eventually become stubble as I progress further inwards. This stubble is drawn as you might imagine. I just make a series of dots with the pencil, all of which are very close together, and it does take some time, but the result is worthwhile. So I'm almost done rendering this section now, and you can see for example how all of the lines that I had made for his hair are drawn in the same direction as they are in the reference image. Also pay attention to how the skin texture changes as we move up the forehead. Those freckles are more pronounced and darker than the rest. There's also these creases and wrinkles in the skin which I have drawn and made sure to outline. So I'll leave it like this for now. As I said, I will be working over all of what I've drawn in another video. Right now I'm just focused on getting all of this rendered in detail. There is a section below the mouth here at the chin which I need to finish before I can progress further. When looking at the reference image, you'll notice that there is a lot of very fine details here, including some smaller hairs and stubble, along with some marks in the skin which seem to be very close together. I do approach this in a way that is similar to how I've been drawing the rest, by creating a collection of marks with the pencil and then adding in these smaller hairs. As always, there is the real-time drawing footage on my Patreon page for you to study if you think that would be useful. There's a lot of stubble to add over all of this. Nothing that I'm doing here is different from what I've just done when drawing out the other sections. Now, I know this is a rather long video, but I'm aiming to get all of these areas finished, and so the next section is the neck down here. If you look at the reference image, you'll see that there's a lot of detail to consider here. It's not so much a generic texture, seeing as there's a lot of creases in his skin and wrinkles which we have to draw in the right place in order for this to look convincing. Thankfully, I had outlined some of these in an earlier video, and so I start by defining these more clearly. In between these lines, I add more lines in the same direction. If you look closely at this section, you'll see that there's a lot of less obvious, I suppose, creases in his skin, and all of this seems to curve around following the shape of his neck. There's also some hairs that we need to add in over it all. These are rather sparse, but I make an effort to draw them in the right place. As I progress with this, I make sure to also leave some gaps between the marks I make with the pencil, as this adds to the texture that I produce. There's also a shadow here under the chin which I make sure to add. To do this, I apply a lot more pressure with the pencil to produce a darker shade. Again, I am still using a 2B pencil here, which might be surprising because I'm able to do all of this. As I've mentioned before, I will be working into the drawing and making some overall adjustments with a softer, darker pencil in a later video, so if the drawing lacks contrast at this stage, don't worry, we are not finished yet. Further down between the collar of his shirt, there is a few hairs which I outline. Also, you can see now how these wrinkles curve around, as I mentioned earlier. That's one thing that I'm always considering as I do this. This has been a rather long video in comparison to the other parts, but I expected that to be the case. It's essential to be able to produce a wide range of textures when it comes to producing realistic portraits like this. So there we go, now I have all of this rendered in detail and I'm happy with how this looks. You can see how all of those small marks I had made with the pencil throughout drawing all of this creates a realistic looking skin texture. At the moment, the drawing as a whole does lack some contrast, but as I said, I will be working into all of this and making some adjustments in a later video. In the next one, we'll look at how to draw out his clothes and also add in a background. But until then, I hope you found this helpful and I will see you in the next one.